Hello and thanks for joining me. Regular viewers might be able to tell that I'm not in my usual surroundings. I am doing a bit of traveling for work this week, so I am coming at you from my hotel room in Portland, Oregon. But I wanted to do a quick chat on Jerusalem by Simon Sebag Montefiore. Jerusalem, the Biography. This is the most recent book that I finished. And following this chat, I'll also touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading. But yeah, Jerusalem, the Biography by Simon Sebag Montefiore. This was originally published in 2011. And this edition that I have is apparently a UK edition. I'm not sure where I got this. I think I got this a couple of years ago. I lived in a building that had a box where people did they could put books they were going to get rid of. They put in this box, and you could kind of swap those. And then I got some books that way. So I think that's where this book came from. But I think it's kind of interesting on the back here. You can tell here it says Pries 179. So I'm not sure. It also says Historia for history. So I'm not sure where this book may have been sold, where it was sold for a price of $179. But I think that's always kind of interesting with used books, right? Sometimes they have little markings like this that give us a glimpse in what their life has been like before they came to you. So I think that's real interesting, where that this cost 179 somethings, wherever it came from. But I wanted to read this book for quite a while now, because I love. First of all, I love history in general, but especially the Mediterranean region, and especially the Eastern Mediterranean region. And so I had never read any sort of history of Jerusalem itself. And so this year, around my priority reading, I structured one of the themes around my priority reading was place. And I was really interested in the identity of place, and so I picked up few books related to place, and this was one of them, Jerusalem. And so that's sort of why I chose it. And it just wound out, even though this is a really big chunker of a book, I read this fairly quickly over the span of just a few days, really. And I, thinking about how to go about this chat, I put a lot of thought into how would I approach a chat like this, because we're talking about this book covers thousands of years, probably about 3,000 years worth of history. So needless to say, it would be very easy to get bogged down into a very long chat, but I need to try to keep this pretty brief. So I thought what I would do is kind of run through the different parts. The book is actually divided up into 9 different parts, and basically the 9 parts really correspond to really historical epics, or historical eras. And so the book actually starts out kind of in a prologue with the founding of Jerusalem, or when Jerusalem first appears in the historical record. It's an Egyptian reference that is thought to refer to Jerusalem, and that was in around the year 1900 BC. This would have been, I think, during the Canaanite era of Palestine, what's today Israel, but the 1900s, so that was during the Bronze Age. And then this book covers really from there all the way up until 1967, and it stops in 1967 after the Six-Day War of 1967. So that's where our story ends for Jerusalem. Of course, Jerusalem's story has not ended, and it hopefully will not end for centuries yet to come, if ever, because it's such a really interesting and unique place, I think, on the earth, that I think it's got such a unique sort of story that I find it really endlessly fascinating. But yeah, so we really start, though, part 1. Let me just get back to the different parts, and I'll just kind of review those fairly quickly. Part 1 is Judaism. So this covers the time from really King David is where it starts, because this was when the kingdoms of Israel were getting united. There was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom of Judea, I think was the southern one. And when King David united the northern and southern, he chose, according to this book, he chose Jerusalem as the capital because it was a neutral city. It had been controlled, I think, by the Jebusites. And so since it was a different, or it was outside of those two kingdoms, I according to this book, he picked it because it was a neutral location. But it became the center, really, of Jewish the Jewish political and religious life because of the temple. The Temple Mount, which was a sacred space to the Jewish people, which was there for centuries and centuries. It actually got rebuilt, got destroyed twice, and the second time it was never rebuilt. The second time it was destroyed was in the year 70 by the Romans. And so this Jewish era is covered really in part one. Part two, Part two of the book is called Paganism. So this covers the time from when the Jewish temple is destroyed and still controlled by the Romans, but before the Roman Empire fell, before the Christian era, really. And Jerusalem at that time was called Aelia by the Romans. And then part three is Christianity. So this was the time, by the time the Christianization of the Roman Empire, all the way through the Byzantine era until really the conquest of Islam in like the 7th century. And so part four is Islam, which is this early Islam from about the 7th century on then really to the medieval period. Part five is Crusades. So this was the European Crusades, the Christian Crusades into the Holy Land, they call it, and into Jerusalem, really trying to conquer Jerusalem. And they did succeed with that back and forth several times, but held it for several centuries. Then part six is the Mamluk period, which is a Muslim, back to being a Muslim period. Part seven is the Ottoman period, which is the Ottoman Turk period. Covers the part seven. Part eight is called Empire. This is the rise of the European empires, really in the early 19th century, and then throughout the 19th century, Napoleon, as well as eventually the British, the Palestine, Transjordan, this whole region would actually come under the control of the British. And then part nine is called Zionism, and this takes Zionism really starts with World War I, really around the time of the Balfour Declaration, and then this part of the book covers all the way up, like I mentioned, up until 1967, the end of the Six-Day War. There is an epilogue that talks a bit about, Jerusalem since the Six-Day War. Just some thoughts about the book, though, when we're talking about this incredible amount of time. Just to give you an idea of the amount of time, here at the very end of the book, it says here at the very end, for 1,000 years, Jerusalem was exclusively Jewish. For about 400 years, Christian. For 1,300 years, Islamic. And not one of the three faiths ever gained Jerusalem without the sword, the mangonel, or the howitzer. Their nationalistic histories tell a rigid story of inevitable progressions to heroic triumphs and abrupt disasters. But in this history, I have tried to show that nothing was inevitable. There were always choices. The fates and identities of Jerusalemites were rarely clear-cut. Life in Herodian, Crusader, or British Jerusalem was always just as complex and nuanced as life is for us today. And so, I really got a sense of that through reading this book, because this amount of time, Jerusalem changed hands, many times, like I mentioned. Also, within these eras, there were conflicts. So there were conflicts, even in the different Muslim eras, there were conflicts over really, its rule. Also, the different ways that the Christians, the minority Christian and Jewish populations were treated during that era. So like when the Christians owned or controlled the city, there were certain, it sort of ebbed and flowed, the amount of freedom that maybe the Muslims had or the Jewish people had. Or likewise, when the Muslims controlled the city, there were restrictions on Jewish people or on Christian people, and those sort of waxed and waned. Sometimes there would be periods, long periods sometimes, even centuries, of relatively free movement of all three religions, and then other times they would be, more restricted. And then the Jerusalem, even up to the 6 Day War and after, that's mentioned in the epilogue, and that's now again controlled by Jewish people. There's been a massive amounts of changes there as well, as far as the different Christian shrines and the Muslim shrines. Everybody still has access to all of their shrines, and they always kind of have, with the exception of the Jews, who were denied access to their western wall, their sacred wall, which is part of their ancient temple. Access to that wall was denied to them off and on for centuries. So, to me, it was really interesting to read the history of the city. I just got this really sense of how ancient it is. When you take those years that I just mentioned, where it was 400 years controlled by Christians, so in the Christian era, probably controlled it the shortest amount of time, but yet it was still 400 years. So if you think about that, that's all the way, if we counted back 400 years for us, that would be basically around the time of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. And so just a grand sweep of time has passed with the city, and how the city fell and was almost deserted on lots of occasions. There was one census one time that only had something like, 100 Jewish people, a couple hundred Christians. There were periods of time when the city was really depopulated because there had been some sort of upheaval, either political, military, or social upheaval had passed through the city, and usually accompanied by lots of violence. That was kind of also a recurring theme throughout all the different historical epics. And then, one other interesting thing I thought about was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a Christian shrine, a Christian church that was actually founded during the Roman era by Constantine's mother, Helena. It's been destroyed a few times, but then the different Christian sects have fought over and continue, I think, to still squabble over the different aspects of it that they own. So the Orthodox Christians, the Catholic Christians, the Armenian Christians, and the Coptic Christians all have sort of a piece of that. The Protestants are sort of left out of that, I gathered. But an interesting thing I heard about was there is right now going on at the National Geographic Museum in Washington, D.C., there is an exhibit on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So it lasts, I think, until May. So I'm going to really try to get down there and see that pretty soon. And I did read something just in the news yesterday about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The different Christian sects that control it have actually closed it as of yesterday in protest to some tax policies of the current government of Jerusalem or Israel. I'm not sure which. So yeah, the sort of controversies continue on, and I have no doubt that probably, they've gone on now for centuries in that city, and they will probably continue, because the thing about it is this city's so tied to the different identities, and the identities sometimes are so at odds with each other. The Christian identity, the Jewish identity, and the Muslim identity. And then the different parts, different types of Judaism that there is, different types of Muslims that there are, and the different types of Christians that there are, that within each of these main groups, there's all these other subgroups that also compete with each other in Jerusalem, and for that, that religious narrative and that historical narrative. So I'm really super glad that I got it read. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much. And like I said, it was kind of a big chunker, but I made my way through it very quickly. So what I'm currently reading, I just finished up Demian by Hermann Hesse. And now I am actually reading, there will be a chat on Demian coming up very soon. I am currently reading Definitely Maybe by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. This is Soviet-era science fiction. I just got started on this. This is a really short work, so I should be finished with it also fairly soon. And before I left on my work travel this week, I did go ahead and do another drawing to see what my read is going to be after Definitely Maybe, since Definitely Maybe is so short. And it is going to be The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, which is pretty, Kazantzakis, which is going to be pretty appropriate, since I just finished Jerusalem. So a story, an alternative story of Jesus, the Christian Jesus. So looking forward to that very much. So that should be coming up very soon. Until next time, take care. Bye.